The question on many anime fans' minds as of late, has anime become political? As the world becomes more and more interconnected and we're exposed to more of other nations' cultures than ever, some people worry that their favorite method of escapism is slowly incorporating elements of real-world issues into its source material.
I think sometimes, especially when you see this a lot in Japanese manga, sometimes authors will put shit in there just because it looks cool.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's like, the curtain is blue kind of like argument. Sometimes you look at something and it's a reference to some Western media or Western history. And a lot of the times it's just Japanese people find Western things cool.
It's too many.
This video aims to address one sole question: is anime political? Stop writing that comment. This video is going to dive into art, history, anime, and of course, politics. Politics were invented in 1998 by John Politics when he said that feminism was okay, I guess. Or actually, sorry, it turns out it's been a thing for like ever. A lot of people have had different definitions of the word politics, but what everyone can traditionally agree on is that it's always been here, and usually at its base level refers to things that people do when it comes to making decisions in a group, things like distribution of resources or status. As the greatest scholar of our time would put it, a lot of things in the modern day get accused of being political, and when they say that, they aren't referring to the distribution of status or resources. They are referencing something relating to hot-button political topics. Of course, this is a very narrow-minded way to look at politics, because one, your nation's politics are not the only ones that are occurring, and it's very possible something political is referring to something that you are not aware of, and because of that, politics are really everywhere. To understand politics, you have to strip this connotation away from it, because politics is not something you do like three kids in a trench coat doing business. Politics is your everyday life. It leads to the things you can or cannot do, and massively impacts or defines your existence. By having your license and driving down the road, you may not be consciously engaging in politics, but the actions you are taking by conforming to these regulations is by virtue political, because there are policies in place that keep you on the road and keep your license updated. Maybe not the best example, but you get what I mean. The decisions that politicians make form your life, and by engaging in that life, you are engaging in politics. Politics has become a dirty word in recent history, and hell, maybe even a long time ago, but I wasn't around for that. It's become intertwined with family feuds, corruption, and scandals. When people say it, they are usually attaching it negatively to something because of these ways of viewing political actions. But realistically, politics is something you engage in every single day of your life. Now is when we get to the very divisive question scratching at the back of everyone's mind right now. Does Japan have politics? Yeah, it turns out they have a lot, and they've actually had a few disagreements over the years, you could say. What is also important is that Japan enjoys art. Wait, what's the correlation? Back during the Heian era, Sakuna had a bunch of bullshit techniques, but also, this was a very influential period for Japanese art history and Japanese history in general. This was when Japan was slowly breaking away from the massive cultural influence of China. There used to be a thing referred to as Kentoshi, or the envoy to Tang China. The objective of Japan was to learn about Chinese culture, studying Buddhism, ways of governing, and so much more. What we know as China these days essentially had the most weight to throw around as a cultural influence in Asia. Some of these exports would manifest in things like the Taika Reform, written by Emperor Kotoku in the year 645, which centered around, as Wikipedia puts it, the Chinese writing system, literature, religion, and architecture, to even dietary habits at this time. Eventually, these cultural exports were suspended, and without the mass injection of Chinese culture, Japan entered a new era of cultural growth, known as Kokufu Bunka. This was an explosion of many facets of Japanese culture that still exist to this day, and many unique works of art would be produced as the people of 9th and 10th century Japan find their cultural footing. Of course, it's not as simple as going, I think I'm gonna invent a new culture. Because the things imported from China were still very influential in how Heian-era Japanese culture developed. Amitism being a particular Buddhist import that spread from India to China in the 4th century, and then to Japan by the 9th. The Amida Buddha statue was created by someone named Jocho, otherwise known as one of, if not the best Buddhist sculptor in Japanese history, and that cultural influence can be found in this statue created by him in 1053. With the cutting off of Chinese culture, Japan would also develop Manyogana, a system that used Chinese characters to represent the Japanese language. This is what spawned the alphabets of hiragana and katakana. Hiragana being something that women were made to use while men kept using Chinese characters before hiragana would be recognized as an official writing method in the Heian era and integrated into the use of kanji. The Tale of Genji is a particular work written in the early 11th century that can be used to glean a lot of historical context about their way of being at the time. It follows Hikaru Genji, someone described as a genius and the second son of an emperor, and a concubine. So, for political reasons of course, Genji was booted from the royal family, renamed to Minamoto, and forced to be a commoner. You can pick up on interesting tidbits like, according to many people, the reason why the characters in this story generally have no name is because the court manners at the time deemed it very rude or off-putting to just say someone's given name, instead referring to them by their position in the court or just by the color of their clothes. The general setting, of course, also being the Heian era of Japan, also means that there are a lot of cultural norms or political issues that ring similar to their time. Post-World War II Japan was dominated by conservative politics following the US military occupation of it from 1948 to 1952. Due to Japan getting a little silly during the war, the United States had Japan surrender sovereignty over Okinawa as a method of military power projection for the US and Asia, and even Japan's conservative leaders at the time, like Yoshida Shigeru, would describe the US Cold War demands as excessive. Near the end of the occupation in 1951, the US would propose a treaty that allowed the US to use forces based in Japan without actually consulting the leaders of the nation, and they also made no explicit promise to defend Japan if Japan were attacked, and even put forward a clause that allowed US troops to intervene in Japanese domestic disputes. This treaty would eventually be replaced in 1960 after the massive protests known as the Anpo protests, as the issues with US occupation were starting to become bipartisan between the Japanese left and right, and tensions skyrocketed right before the 60s began as the people of Japan feared that they would be locked into a Cold War conflict. And conservative politician Nobusuke Kishi, the prime minister at the time, called 500 police officers into the chambers to have lawmakers who opposed this treaty removed from the premises. The massive protests would have multiple goals per Wikipedia: the prevention of the ratification of the new treaty, the resignation of Nobusuke Kishi, and the cancellation of the visit from US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and they got just about everything they wanted. This large-scale sweeping movement was largely a left-wing movement, becoming affiliated with 1,600 organizations including labor unions, farmers and teacher unions, poetry circles, theater troupes, student and women's organizations, mother groups, groups affiliated with Japan's socialist and communist parties, while some conservatives clung to America's influence in Japan. Tatsuo Ikeda is a famous Japanese avant-garde artist known for creating art that is relevant to post-war Japan, and a paper by Linda Hoagland titled Protest Art in 1950s Japan would bring up some of Ikeda's work that reflected Japanese sentiment at the time of US occupation. Ikeda would draw American soldier child barracks after visiting American military bases, a comment on the women in post-war Japan that turned to occupation soldiers for financial support, as most of the men in their lives were now dead from the war. Quote, "More than anything, I am anti-war. The Korean War was a foreign war, but I felt it was inevitable that Japan would get dragged into it, and that is what terrified me." His fear was not unfounded, for we know now that the United States was exerting great pressure on the Japanese government to rebuild ground forces quickly enough so that they could be deployed in Korea. In resisting this pressure, Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru used the popular protests in Japan to explain why this was politically impossible so soon after the war. This piece would couple the sentiment of Ikeda's, remarking how the US expects Japan to resurrect the dead to fight a war they have no involvement in. Lots of Japanese art speaks of the circumstances of occupied Japan, and a few years after this, crew members of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 tuna crawler were exposed to nuclear fallout from a thermonuclear bomb test conducted by the United States. This would serve as a flashpoint all across Japan as they worried about the threat of nuclear annihilation. Ikeda would paint 10,000 count in reference to this event, and would argue he, quote, wanted to express himself as a painter, to express his protest that way, end quote. The title referring to a Geiger counter reading, and buried fish. He also wrote, quote, "I see vividly now the fear the victims of the Lucky Dragon felt towards the hydrogen bombs. It makes the nerves rattle, invisible needles riding the wind, mixed with the tide drifting in and out, killing and decomposing organisms at unexpected times and in unexpected places. These are the ghosts of the 20th century. No, this will end worse than ghosts," end quote. While it's easy with context to say that Ikeda's art is outwardly political, with no context and to the uneducated eye, that might not be so obvious. A pertinent example is Godzilla. one of the most recognizable symbols of Japanese pop culture worldwide, a franchise spawning from the Japanese fear of atomic bombs, stemming from the same incident that spurred Ikeda into action to create these paintings, and many people are likely none the wiser. Even if the author of Godzilla had not intended it, which I'm not sure if they did or not, a giant monster coming out of irradiated Japan shortly after the bombings of World War II and the test bombs of Lucky Dragon No. 5 gives you insight into the fears of Japan at that time. Even if art itself is not outwardly political, simply examining the circumstances of its creation can give insight into the author's mind. No matter what, art is created via political means and are circumstances of society because art is like a snapshot in time. It will be a creation of circumstance. Every single value we hold pushes us into making certain choices, even if the value and choice don't seem intertwined. I speak about this in my video purely about isekai, which probably sounds crazy to hear, but 9/11 also had a particular effect on American literature, seeing a tremendous uptick in apocalyptic fiction, as the attacks on that day felt like a mirage of safety and optimism had come crashing down around the average American, and as the years went on and people had the time to look back and introspect over the effects of the attacks on not just the people themselves, but the nation's politics. A common argument against this type of thinking is, well, what if I grabbed a pile of my own shit and threw it at the wall like an ape and called it art, and ironically, that in itself is a piece critical of the state of modern art. In an attempt to prove that art has no messaging, you've included a message, as no matter what, art will say something about the world, even if it's not the world of today. Well, I just spoke for a few minutes about Japanese art and history. What does this have to do with anime exactly? Well, unless you disagree with the idea that anime is art, why would anime be an exception that some people like to claim? That's enough about vague Japanese history. Let's talk about anime's history. If we go back really far, you'll find some definite political influence in extremely old anime. Pre-World War II, Japan would attempt to use this piece of art as a means of cultural influence, and Jonathan Clements would note in his book, Anime A History, that in the 1930s, Japanese animators were urged to produce anime that enforced the Japanese spirit and national affiliation. Ergo, even the roots of Japanese anime were overtly political. Post-war Japan would see a lot of cultural imports as well as exports from the United States due to occupation at the time. 1940s and 1950s Japan would see a flourishing of anime and manga, taking lots of inspiration from US media. Continuing the anti-occupation trend of its time, an anime film known as Muko no Ki no Hanasi would capture the general feeling of US occupation at the time, depicting it as an unwelcome season that would soon pass. Osamu Tezuka is one of those people that would be deeply impacted by the US's influence on Japan, a man known as the father of manga, or the Japanese equivalent of Walt Disney. Tezuka would be massively influenced by the exported media he had seen, people describing aspects of his style influenced by Hollywood like his, quote, deep focus cinematography and big eyes, end quote, which he got from Disney movies. Of course, he did not just make American movies, but he would create a blend of Japanese and American media, including very Japanese aspects like the glorification of self-sacrifice that Japan held. Influence comes from all walks of life, like we mentioned earlier. They create a snapshot of people's values and circumstances. Occupation was a clear influence. Japanese self-sacrifice was another, and yet another would be due to his mother's embrace of the arts, often taking him to romantic musicals aimed at a female audience that would influence his character designs going forward. Living life during World War II Japan and experiencing post-war Japan and the threat of nuclear annihilation, it's no secret where Tezuka would get his value of the preciousness of life. Quote, "Our beautiful, glass-like Earth, so easily shattered, floats in the loneliness of the vast universe. Against this unending blackness of the depths of the universe, how beautiful this planet of water is. Perhaps it represents the world of mysticism itself. If just once we could be witness to that vast universe, it may be that we would never want to harm our precious air, water, greenery, or our oceans ever again." End quote. US influence has always been present in anime. From its initial inception to the works of Tezuka, the release of Star Wars also heavily influenced anime, for better or for worse. Even without US influence, it's not as if the entire nation of Japan and its 125 million are so infantile that they didn't have their own political thoughts and biases. The aforementioned Godzilla, which was in large part inspired by nuclear fears at the time, Miyazaki and his distaste for exploitation and environmental damage, isekai as a genre being spawned from the horrid working and material conditions of Japan in recent times, For some reason, Japan has garnered a reputation outside of Japan that has led to the entire nation being largely infantilized, some people becoming entirely deluded by assumptions they make about the country. There is in fact an entire strategy created by the Japanese government known as Cool Japan, following in the footsteps of Cool Britannia. It was an initiative to expand Japan's soft power as they were no longer legally able to expand hard power, attempting to spread popular aspects of Japanese culture to the rest of the world, and to improve its image after its imperialist history pre-World War II. Weeaboos have fallen hook, line, and sinker for Japan's cultural reframing. Of course, pre-World War II was some time ago, but that doesn't change that Japan is picking and choosing what of its culture it chooses to put out, attempting to sweep any of the bad parts under the rug or outright denying that they ever happened, like the Nanjing Massacre. In 2007, 100 Liberal Democratic Party members claimed it was a fabrication. A few years later, the governor of Tokyo would deny it happened and say that it would have been impossible to kill that many people, and according to English Wikipedia, Japanese Wikipedia has been criticized for promoting denialist or revisionist narratives about the Nanjing Massacre. As recently as 2022, in a continued effort to uwuify itself, Japan straight up deleted the military's role in comfort women from its textbooks. Any at all mention of forceful relocation was also removed. For those unfamiliar, comfort women were women that were forced into sexual slavery by Imperial Japan. The nation regularly utilizes rhetoric similar to the lost cause of the Confederacy, conveniently sweeping under the rug the reason why Japan had suffered so much during World War II, and instead trying to paint their actions during the war as just. The nation has undergone decades of sterilization of their national history, projecting their soft power to other parts of the world through the use of their cool and fun video games or their silly and unique anime, to the point that to some weebs, they have completely wiped the slate clean and are just a victim to the nations around them. Not to imply that Japan wasn't a victim at times in history, because it definitely was, but the issues Japan faces now are of its own accord, and are not bred purely out of soft power projection of other nations. Many of the current people in power right now are affiliated with Nippon Kaigi, an organization which firmly believes that the 1946 to 1948 Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was illegitimate. Japan has been held in a conservative death grip by an ever-aging government, dubbed the Silver Democracy. This trend has led young progressive voters to feeling disenfranchised, growing disillusioned with Japan's political system, and they simply stop showing up, as the age gap, student organization bans, and continued lack of work-life balance drive them to become disinterested. You can make the claim that the US is influencing all of Japan if you want, but the reality of the situation is that the people of Japan, the people that actually live there, aren't exactly happy with the way things are. Despite the nation itself not recognizing same-sex marriages, according to the Washington Post using Sankei Shimbun statistics, 71% of Japanese people support same-sex marriage, and 91% of people ages 18 to 29 are in support. Professor of Sociology Kiyotaro Tsutsui from Stanford also found that a majority of respondents were supporting more men taking parental leave, supporting increasing the number of female politicians, executives, and board members. They were not supportive of traditional gender roles, the highest majority yet disapproving of the statement, men should work outside the home and women should stay home, and boys should be raised to be manly and girls should be raised to be womanly. A lot of the Japanese public dislikes the very thing that American conservative anime fans wish to hold on to, and no, seeing a Japanese tweet with 10,000 likes doesn't mean all of Japan might as well join the Confederacy. Twitter is not real life, that's just confirmation bias. You can find the same rhetoric being used on Japanese Twitter, and this one tweet came across my timeline where a Japanese illustrator made note of how people on Japanese Twitter try to make it sound like the West is unanimously in favor of AI-generated art, but they can find all kinds of tweets of Westerners not enjoying it. Jumpscare warning. Japan is just like any other nation on Earth, with its own political issues, its own wide spectrum of people, and its own circles of the internet, but yeah, SJWs did it or something. In fact, some of the most popular manga and anime of our time are openly anti-conservative or anti-establishment. One Piece is the biggest manga in the world, for God's sake, and has a large part of anti-establishment politics baked into it from my understanding. Vinland Saga is openly against traditional gender norms, is anti-slavery, and is also anti-war. Spy Family is about stopping a far-right ultranationalist political party. Jujutsu Kaisen has Gojo saying fuck the conservatives every 30 seconds until he kills all of them. My Hero Academia continually criticizes the older generation and calls them simplistic and insinuates that they do not understand the nuance and plight of the oppressed. Fujimoto has written about trans experiences a few times. ReZero is anti-racism and has multiple woke takes on gender identity. Bloom Into You is extremely popular, and it's a manga about two gay women coming to terms with a sense of identity and their own ideas of love. These are all heavy hitters. Feminism and LGBT issues were not born 30 minutes ago because anime. It in fact has a studied and lengthy history in Japan. Feminism in Japan can be traced back to the start of the 20th century, though I'm sure it definitely existed before that, like with the Blue Stocking magazine. The New Women Association was founded in 1919, attempting to lift up women from their current status of the Taisho era. hoping to allow women to be involved in the nation's politics. Shortly after, the Red Wave came to be, an organization of women that was staunchly anti-capitalist, relating to how capitalism and patriarchal society exploited women. These organizations would have powerful standings, regularly pressuring the Japanese government as well as taking part in multiple relief projects like after the Great Kanto earthquake. After years of fighting, women would finally get the right to vote on April 10th, 1946. That's really not that long ago when you think about it. During the Meiji period of Japan, the nation had extremely strict publication laws, requiring all publications to go through pre-publication review and obtain approval from the Ministry of Education. This would be used as a cudgel by Imperial Japan to crush any kind of literature it deemed to be a threat to the nation, oftentimes targeting leftist, progressive, or feminist works, until the new constitution was instituted in 1946. I wonder where leftist influence was coming from in the 1940s. Surely the United States of America. Just because women gained the right to vote does not mean that their work was done. Mitsu Tanaka is a notable example of a post-war feminist author who in the 1970s would write about how women have been turned into toilets, an object that is convenient for the fulfillment of a man's urges and aimed to deconstruct the household system. In the modern era, women are still facing issues. A few years ago, it was noticed that the Tokyo Medical University was lowering all test scores for women because it was, quote, necessary evil since they get married or pregnant and resign, end quote. This caused people all around the nation to go to social media and go, hey, things are kind of weird, like this tweet where someone's manager asked a German if he was mad that his prime minister was a woman, or, quote, a woman with her middle school daughter said with a straight face, my daughter is a girl and there is discrimination in Japan, so I thought I'd send her abroad after all. It's hell for girls to study, work, and give birth in Japan, end quote. Of course, like we mentioned earlier, these are just tweets, but there are serious organizations out there that are still battling for women's rights, like the Women's Action Network or the Working Women's Network. And if you look at the raw data, things are still rough. 40.5% of women said that they don't want to date or marry because they do not want to compromise their freedom and independence. And women right now are fighting for the Kutu movement, attempting to fight mandatory high heels in workplaces. Just because you don't pay attention to Japanese news doesn't mean it's not happening. What does make the Japanese outlook unique is that though women specifically want freedom from male decision-making, they don't necessarily feel that means that they have to relinquish established roles within familial structures. And of course, we should also mention the harsh roles that men are cast into, which the same study touches upon, that men are expected to succeed at work and support a family, to not cry or become emotional, and to show leadership, which a lot of people there are not fond of. If we look at this through the lens of feminism, you can see a stark difference in the way women are treated in fiction, which reflects the changing independence and social views of Japanese women because, as we established earlier, a lot of those views are injected into art whether intentional or not. This was a big thing I touched on quite some time ago in my How Modern Isekai Came to Be video, about the stories of Japanese citizens being worked to the bone, fearing nuclear annihilation, and facing isolation. People would turn to the stories that they feel empowers them, and there's no reason this wouldn't be the same for the people writing. More and more series are giving female characters stronger roles like Witch Hat Atelier, or Frieren, or Lycoris Recoil, or so many other modern anime. There's also a growing number of LGBT-friendly anime like My Hero Academia, including openly gay or trans characters, or Bloom Into You and how it explores gay identity, or recent big hits like Windbreaker having a trans character and not playing it for a joke, or Gundam Witch of Mercury. These social issues have always been present and growing in modern-day Japan, whether it be the ever-increasing march of feminism or the country's history with socialist movements, and saying otherwise is just a cheap way to deny the people of Japan their own autonomy, and it minimizes the harm that Japanese women and LGBT folk went through and also continue to go through.
I am not from bureaucrats, I'm not politician. So then automatically, it's difficult. Issues like climate change, diversity, the gender equality, of course, has been challenged by the kind of old politics or the boys' club.
In an online political landscape where you have a multitude of anti-woke, anti-SJW anime YouTubers who will jump at the chance to talk about any perceived slights towards Japanese culture or the harassment of Japanese creators, naturally, it's crickets when it comes to a progressive Japanese person, as more and more anime YouTube content enjoyers inadvertently get pulled to the right to become useful idiots to a person who is exploiting your ignorance for monetary gain. There's also a fundamental question of, if art is supposed to have no meaning or doesn't affect real life, why are we so angry about wokeism in our shows? Why are we making rage bait videos every day about it? It's just a grift that they hope you won't question. In 2008, a French author known as Annie Ernaux wrote a book and described the ever-changing political landscape of the world. The rumor was going around that politics was dead. The advent of a new world order was declared. The end of history was nigh. The word struggle was discredited as a throwback to Marxism, becoming an object of ridicule. As for defending rights, the first that came to mind were those of the consumer. As Anton Jaeger of Jacobin put it, she diagnosed a shuttered and claustral world in which people had retreated into privacy, where politics was relegated to the back burner while technocrats were in charge. She would discuss the political ice age of the fall of the Berlin Wall, an era that Anton would call a, quote, mixture of diffidence and apathy. But it's very clear that in the 2020s, that era of post-politics has come to an end. Mass national protests, record voter turnouts, and so much more. Gone are the days of avoiding politics with those in your life or attempting to claim being neither right nor left, and now are the times of hyper-politics of the modern era, making or breaking relationships based on political beliefs and newfound political extremism. George Orwell would once write that no book is genuinely free from political bias, and the opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is itself a political attitude. Is everything political? Well, what is everything? Perhaps the furthest you can get away from politics is to look up at the heavens above that put on full display how truly insignificant we are, but even then, you're just one degree of separation away as the most powerful people on the planet work towards the colonization of those heavenly objects. Perhaps the act of taking a shit isn't inherently political, but water-saving toilets mandated by the state might be. So too can the sewage infrastructure that is handled by city officials, or the kind of bathroom you might be allowed or not allowed to use could be national news. A common counter-argument to the inclusion of politics in art is that it somehow arbitrarily dates the art, as if that isn't something that happens globally already. Maybe Sam Raimi should have made Spider-Man because he wrapped up filming in June 2001, and then, something very notable happened immediately after, causing edits to the film to be made. Perhaps all those people shouldn't have made pieces of art relating to World War II because eventually World War II will be old news, completely disregarding that at the time, World War II was all they knew. Perhaps all these highly stylized old animated movies shouldn't have been made because one day their technological advancements would become obsolete. Perhaps all of those slice-of-life animes shouldn't exist because what if one day Japanese schools are replaced with liberal hypno warehouses? The truth of the matter is that every single piece of art is by virtue dated, and that's fine. Sometimes it's fun to look into the past via art. It's funny because sometimes you also get things like Final Fantasy VII, a game created by a Japanese studio about corporations and accelerated climate change. And when you hear that, you might think it's a recent game, but it was made in fucking 1997, and the creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, finds relation to current events and politics a core ingredient to the series. Do keep in mind that Final Fantasy VII is one of the most critically acclaimed games of, all time. The art possibly being dated didn't seem to impact that very much now, did it? It's a self-defeating argument that isn't very strong because it's not really what they care about. People want anime to be art, but refuse to accept its political and therefore artistic merit. Even though Japan has a large conservative population, that doesn't mean that counterculture can't exist. It feels arbitrary to be able to suspend your disbelief for 400-year-old lollies or insanely powerful spellcasters or women with breasts so large that their spines would shatter, but stopping to clutch your pearls at the concept of a minority or an explicitly feminist theme being present. If politics are so prevalent in people's favorite works, what is it really about? Because it surely can't be about the inclusion of politics. You'd have to be insanely disconnected to be mad about that. What you see every single time from these online outrage circles is the same song and dance. You very rarely see people call into question conservative politics in anime. It's always potentially progressive politics. So what the issue is isn't the fact that there's political content, the issue is that it's not right-wing politics. There's a reason that there is no outrage from your typical ragebait YouTubers about Gundam Witch of Mercury having mentions of its gay couple being practically silenced, or Astro Royale including a trans character to belittle them and make references to them having ulterior motives and tricking men. Not a peep from ragebait YouTubers though, when it comes to keeping narratives out of anime. Nope. Just right-wing stuff, I guess. That's because to some people online, anime is seen as a final bastion of good media because it originates from a country with right-wing leadership, but it's also very clear to people who seriously engage with the media that that bias is not represented in all of its works. Not to imply that every manga is out there pushing for space communism, but the amount of stories I've read even just recently that treat homosexuality as not that big of a deal or take female characters far more seriously than their counterparts of old tell a very clear story of Japan's shifting social views. In an effort by right-wing rage-bait content creators to de-westernize anime, they have ironically brought the West front and center and made the discourse Eurocentric, utilizing Japan as a proxy to stand against their own nation's social progress, and attempting to make them exempt from social strife. You know, what makes this especially funny is that while making this video, some early polling information was released from Japanese citizens' thoughts on the upcoming US 2024 election, with 75% of respondents wanting a Kamala Harris presidency and 16% wanting Donald Trump. Not exactly the far-right bastion of hope you might expect if you stay online and watch ragebait videos too much. It's this weird double standard argument where Japan is apparently having its agency stripped from it in an effort to adhere to Western culture for the benefit of the Western market, when if these people got what they wanted, you would be stripping Japanese creators of their own autonomy and narrative decisions to benefit you, the Western market. Hence the entire go woke, go broke soft boycott. Make it make sense. The West is simultaneously so powerful that they can corrupt all Japanese media, turning it woke and erasing all Japanese culture, but so weak that even in domestic markets, all of their media fails because go woke, go broke, like noted failure Baldur's Gate 3. Fun fact by the way, this is a common fascist rhetoric piece. Politics has always been involved in anime and Japanese art, and of course art globally. Don't fall for the narrative that it's only happening now to infect Japan. Do not fall for the stripping of agency from Japanese citizens. A lot of people just get really worked up about overt left-wing politics in their series, unless you somehow don't pick up on any of the incredibly in-your-face messaging from a series, like Cyberpunk Edgerunners, that had anti-SJW YouTubers praising it for being not in-your-face politics, which, I love that show. It's just not true, though. Thank you for the banger tweet on that, by the way. It's all a transparent ploy to oppose social progress and to profit off of the rage that is generated, and I don't want you guys to fall for it. I hope I was able to demonstrate the deep interconnection of politics and the art people involved in society create, and show you that this is not a new phenomenon. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe for more. You can also check the description down below to become a member, which gives you benefits like early videos, membership badges, and cool custom emotes. You can join the Discord where we talk about ReZero, Kagurabachi, Jujutsu Kaisen, and all kind of stuff. Additionally, you can go to the channel store and pick up some awesome stickers made by our channel artist, so you can carry the power of Graphia with you on your water bottle. That's about it though. Thank you for watching. See ya.